Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for an evening of horrifying tales that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. This week, we have 11 brand new frightening tales to share with you. If you have a story to share, please be sure to reach out via the details listed in the description below. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. The Man Hiding in My Porch. About 2 nights ago, I went to see the new Wicked movie with my family who was in town for Thanksgiving. I arrived back at my house around midnight. I live alone in a shared but divided house with 2 other tenants living inside. One is upstairs and one splits the downstairs with me, so there's 3 apartments total. My place is in the back of the house and has a back porch you can enter through after walking up the whole driveway. When I got home, I sat in my bedroom and did about 20 to 30 minutes of work on my computer. During this time, the house was very quiet, and I kept hearing a man's voice continuously talking. Now, keep in mind, the tenant above me is a man, and I know his bedroom is right above mine because I previously lived up there. It sounded like he was talking on the phone, just because of how long and continuous the talking went on. I tried to listen and figure out where the voice was coming from, and I couldn't exactly pinpoint it, but it was either coming from through the ceiling or on the other side of my room. Now it must be noted that my bedroom connects to the porch with a door that I have blocked with my dresser. There's a main door inside the porch that you use to get into the house, but there's also this strange door connecting to my room. I couldn't make out the words, but because of how firm and continuous the voice was going on, I figured it just had to be coming from my housemate upstairs. It's the only thing that made logical sense. I just kept on thinking, though, I had never heard a single voice come through that ceiling before. It's not that thin. Whatever, I'm worrying about nothing, I thought. After about 20 to 30 minutes of computer work, I got up to go brush my teeth, feed my fish, get ready for bed, etc. I came back into my room, turned off the lights, and got in bed. Keep in mind, it had been about 45 to 60 minutes since I first heard the voice, and I could still hear it. Damn, I thought. My housemate is chatting up a storm on the phone up there. Oh, how wrong I was. After about 3 minutes of laying in bed, I all of a sudden heard my porch door creaking along with the talking man's voice. It has a very distinct sound that I knew immediately was my porch door. I crept across my room and put my ear to the dresser and the door that connects to the porch. Sure enough, the talking was coming from inside my porch, and I could hear the door moving and shuffling inside my porch along with it. My heart absolutely dropped. All the lights were off in my house at this point, so I had a sort of sneaky advantage to creep around my house and get a view of what was going on. I crept down my hallway and peered into the kitchen, which the porch leads into. Across the kitchen, through the door, and in a streak of moonlight, I saw a man with long, scraggly hair sitting curled up in the center of my porch, turned around with his back to me, muttering out loud to himself and rocking back and forth. My fight or flight kicked in, and I immediately ripped open the door and started screaming at him to get out and trying to intimidate him. Looking back, I probably shouldn't have made myself so vulnerable without a weapon handy, but like I said, I was just in fight or flight. I can't explain my actions in that moment other than reacting out of fear and determination to scare him out. Anyways, this dude didn't even react to me whipping the door open and screaming at him. Not even a flinch. He simply turned his head to the side very slowly and said, "My name is Evan." This freaked me out so much for some reason, especially because he still hadn't turned around or shown his face. I said I didn't care and kept cursing at him to leave, and he slowly rose up with his hands up and said, I know, I'm hiding." He wasn't saying it in a pleading way, though. He said it with this almost childlike, playful tone that absolutely freaked me out. I hated this. The fact that he kept trying to reason with me and act so mysterious while still not even turning around to show his face just pissed me off, honestly. Who do you think you are, bro? I ran him out of the porch and was just threatening him. Now, I assume it was just a homeless man who was under the influence of something, as I do live in an inner city area, and it's common to see homeless people near my street. But I don't know, man. The sight of seeing him in my porch and knowing he was there for at least an hour beforehand while I was sitting right there just freaked me out. I was in full-blown defense mode by the time I opened that door, and I wasn't willing to waste any time to do a character dive on the guy. No imaginable situation would permit anyone to be in my porch like that at that hour. Needless to say, I'll be double-checking my porch lock every night from now on. It's funny because, having my room connected to the porch, I always had this horrific, intrusive thought that I'd hear someone in there one night. Looks like it came true. So please, Evan, let's not ever meet again, you creepy bastard. Story 2. The Stranger Staring at Our Window. Not sure if this is enough interaction to constitute an encounter, but it was weird. About 4 years ago, my family moved from our local rural English village to a slightly busier local rural town. In the village, we knew absolutely everybody, but the town, we knew way less. The new place is a townhouse, and as if it isn't creepy enough that we live opposite a graveyard, next to that graveyard is the huge walled-off grounds to the old hospital asylum. It's also worth mentioning that this town is known to be pretty dangerous, and was actually known as the murder town of the UK for several years. That being said, apart from a few run-ins in college, I never felt particularly vulnerable there. We moved in late November, and so by Christmas, we had only lived there for a few weeks. My ex and I came home for the holidays and spent a few nights at my parents' and then hers. One night, my parents were in the living room and my ex and I were arguing, but we wanted to talk things out discreetly, so we went upstairs to my parents' room. It was about 1 a.m. As we were arguing, I felt this weird sensation and randomly glanced out the window to the street. Everything seemed normal at first until I saw somebody dressed in all black, standing completely still in the old hospital grounds, just staring directly at our window. I couldn't make out any features of theirs. Once my ex realized that I had stopped arguing and was visibly creeped out, she looked too and was like, "What the fuck?" Something instantly felt wrong, and I didn't respond. I was looking to see if maybe the person had a dog they were walking, but after a couple minutes, I realized they hadn't moved a muscle. Where they stood, the only thing at normal eye level to them would have been the wall surrounding the grounds, though they were clearly facing up at our window. Anyway, who walks their dog at 1 a.m. in the middle of English winter? I told my ex to move away from the window for some reason. They stood there for 15 minutes straight, staring directly up at the window, not moving at all. I stared back, completely frozen the whole time, just studying everything about the situation, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I moved away from the window and told my dad. He double-checked everything was locked and told us just to sit with them for a bit. About an hour later, curiosity got the better of me, and I checked the window again. They were gone. My partner and I had been arguing for well over 20 minutes before I noticed. Had that person been watching us the whole time? Story 3. The Small Ghost Boy by Human Presentation 89. I'm 40 years old now, and this story happened to me when I was a child. I was in 5th grade at the time, so it was about 30 years ago, but I remember it like yesterday. Very vividly. I had never before seen a ghost, and thankfully have never seen one again, and do not wish to. I had maternal grandparents that lived about 7 hours away from us, and we would drive to visit them a couple of times a year. My grandfather was an early riser, up well before the sun. When we would stay there, my siblings and I would use sleeping bags on the living room floor, and our mom would sleep in the same room on the old green couch. This would mean that when my grandpa awoke, I would typically hear him tooling around in the kitchen that was just off the living room. He would always start coffee, leave the house, drive to the grocery store, and come home with fresh donuts for us grandkids. I would wake up early and eat chocolate donuts, and he would let me drink coffee. When I was in 5th grade, he passed from cancer. We went up for the funeral service. It was your typical funeral experience. Everyone was terribly sad. The vibes were gloomy and low. There was a gathering in my grandparents' house afterward with food and relatives well into the night. After it ended, we got to bed in our usual spots. I woke up to some loud noises coming from the kitchen in the middle of the night. I was disoriented and had no idea what time it was. Out of habit and being tired, at first I assumed it was just Grandpa waking up for the day, making coffee, etc. Except normally when he did this, he was quiet, and he would have the stovetop light glowing, sending some soft light into the living room. This time, all the fluorescent kitchen lights were on, and the banging was loud like cupboards being slammed and dishes moving around. I looked to my mom and siblings, all still asleep, clearly not bothered by the noises. At this point, I was really wide awake and realized it was not Grandpa. He was not here anymore. The noises suddenly stopped. The light went out. I called out, "Grandma?" wondering if she was awake and having a hard time. Nothing. I kept my eye on the doorway into the kitchen. It was pitch black. I told myself I was just dreaming. I lay there for what seemed to be forever and tried to calm my racing heart. A feeling of terror flooded me, like a panic so severe I was paralyzed. I didn't want to move an inch. As I kept my focus on the doorway, a shape began to materialize in the darkness there. It was a white shape hovering about 3 inches off the floor, and I couldn't tell what it was. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, trying to clear it away. I felt terrified and frozen. I laid absolutely still, willing myself not to even breathe. The form slowly moved, floating ethereally and slowly towards me. I have no idea how long this lasted. I hid my eyes and entire head inside my sleeping bag. I could hear my brothers and Mom breathing peaceful, sleeping breaths near me. Enough time passed, and I told myself I would look out and see nothing. It was quiet and calm again, so I braved a look. At the end of my sleeping bag stood, or actually hovered, a small boy who looked to be about 6 years old. He was wearing a white nightgown with long sleeves, not clothing that even remotely matched anything from the current century. This was the 90s, and he looked like he was straight out of the 1800s. He was hovering. He had no feet. In his hand was a metal candle holder with a candlestick in it that had a flame. The flame was not casting any light. It was blue. He had messy tussles of brown hair all around his pale face and dark circles under his eyes. He looked very sick and very cold. I say he was cold because I could feel the coldness, even under my sleeping bag. He just hovered there, staring at me. I once again covered my head, waited, and looked back out. He remained there, no real expression on his face. I was scared out of my mind, but I got a weird feeling that he was safe and not going to hurt me. It was odd, like he was sending me into a trance. It was as if he was sending me the feeling to be calm, like he wanted or needed me to calm down. I started to stare into the blue flame on the candlestick. As my gaze got lost there, I suddenly again had a feeling of fear and horror. I was back in reality. I heard more loud banging from the kitchen. My mother was about 5 feet away on the couch. I mustered all my internal courage as this thing hovered above me. It was like he could sense and anticipate that I wanted to get away from him, and his features began to change. His eyes grew very, very dark black. The circles under them became more pronounced and severe. I sprang from my sleeping bag, looking over my shoulder at him. He began to come forward very quickly toward me, and I cried loudly, "Mom!" I was absolutely sure he was going to reach me before I got to her. She seemed so far away. I scrambled across the floor, crawling as fast as I could, and reached my mother, shaking her and crying, waking her up in a panic. I couldn't even get more words out to tell her what was happening. As she woke up, I turned around to gesture toward my now empty sleeping bag, and the ghost boy was gone. I never saw him again. She assured me her childhood home had always been safe and fine. She had never seen anything like that. I snuggled up with her on the couch and went back to sleep. Although subsequently when we visited, my parents opted for us to stay at my uncle's house in his RV rather than staying at my grandparents' house, never saying why. Fast forward years, I was a young adult and recounted this story to my mother. We never really talked about it because it reminded me of my grandfather passing, and that was a horribly sad time for my mom. I never wanted to bring it back up. That house has been sold with my grandmother passing too, and we don't go there anymore. She told me that at the time, she didn't want to scare me when I was little, but when she was a child, she always felt a presence in her room at night, and once woke up there to the feeling of being pulled from her bed by her ankles. One time, she actually woke up in the middle of the night to her record player blaring Pink Floyd's Ringing of the Division Bell out of a dead sleep. She had removed the record player from her room after that. She thinks it was the same entity, although she said she never saw him. We don't know what it was or why it was there. I've never had another experience like it, and I hope I never do. Story 4. Sleep Paralysis and a Satanic Entity by LilMizManda. Years ago, I inherited a house. My parents, never having stayed in one particular room of the house, they always just stayed in the master bedroom, never gave us any negative back history or anything besides things that would need fixed or replaced throughout the home. At the time of moving in, I wasn't aware that as a person who's died and been brought back, I am very sensitive to certain things. Thinking back now, even from the very beginning, we always had little things happening. However, we always passed it off and made sensible excuses for things or ignored it. We were skeptics, to be honest. Even when we saw with our own eyes light orbs above our newborn's crib midday, I simply excused it as dust in the air with sun shining into our room in an odd direction or something. Our daughter is our miracle, as we had just finally brought her home. She almost died 4 times and was in the neonatal intensive care unit for 11.5 months. After adjusting to the life of new parents, we started remodeling, and this specific week, the heavy energy in the house turned almost angry. It's the only way I can explain how it felt. Adding to it, anything that could go wrong did. That week, my husband kept waking up and wasn't sleeping right. One night, he awoke in a total panic, but also in a total paralysis, dry heaving and gasping. When he was finally able to move his arms, he started hitting toward and yelling at me, and he said, "Why are you sitting on my back? I can't move." But I couldn't even process what he was saying, because as soon as he had startled me awake, I opened my eyes to his frantic screaming and saw a teenage girl, or small woman, with a foggy hue surrounding her. She was sitting at the end of our bed, directly at his feet. Someone told me it's relevant to add that beside his foot was a 4-way uncovered outlet. Some say, including the person I spoke with about this, that entities can pull energy from electricity. I don't know if that's true, but I just wanted to explain what I have been told. As soon as I was able to take my eyes off of her to help him and listen to what he was screaming, I immediately looked back, and she was completely gone. After getting up to change our sheets from a small amount of vomit from what had just happened, he looked at me confused, saying, "I can't explain it. It felt like someone was sitting on my back, pinning me to the bed, but jamming their hand in my mouth, like trying to go down my throat. People don't vomit in their sleep. What was that?" He truly thought it was me teasing him until he realized I was asleep and couldn't have been on his back. I eventually told him about the woman who looked like she was a dream, but in reality. She was like a black and white movie, but in our world of color, in our reality. I slept in the living room after that, until we moved not long after this incident. We heard things all the time, like someone walking up and down the stairs, doors opening and closing, all the usual paranormal stuff you hear people say but never really believe. Until that night, it was never violent or terrifying. After that night, we learned no room was safe anymore. We had mysterious random electrical fires, and you could literally feel the heaviness in the air walking in from outside. If we stayed home for too long, that energy made you feel like you were depressed, angry, and fatigued. It's like it drained all of you, but gave you all of it, or something. After moving, we learned a boy had painted dark symbols on the walls and practiced dark ideals until he killed himself in that exact room of the house. My parents were never notified because the young teen was taken to the ER where he later died, and he wasn't pronounced dead at the home, so the realtor didn't break any law by not disclosing this information. I don't know if his satanic beliefs and painting of the dark arts on the walls and floors with spray paint made all that happen or not. I just know it did happen to us, and I'm not a skeptic anymore. Story 5. The Worst Hotel Experience I've Ever Had, by Small Cycle 940. Earlier this year, I stayed at the DoubleTree by Hilton in Kingston upon Thames, London, for a business trip. I chose the hotel for its proximity to meetings, but I vowed never to return. The first 3 days were normal. I attended meetings and explored town. I didn't notice anything unusual until the 4th day. I felt like someone watched me as I walked to my room, and I heard faint sounds outside my door, like footsteps pausing before moving on. On the 4th day, I found a printed note under my door with the DoubleTree logo. It said, "Want to skip the wait? Order room service online. Scan this QR code to get started." I scanned the QR code and went to a professional-looking website. It had the DoubleTree logo, a menu, and a login page. I logged in using my Hilton Honors account and ordered a sandwich and a drink. The website said my order would arrive in 20 minutes, but an hour later, nothing came. I called the front desk, but they said no order had been placed. I checked the website again and couldn't figure out what went wrong. Frustrated, I decided to have dinner elsewhere, thinking it was just a technical glitch. That night, I noticed someone slouched against the hallway wall, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low. He seemed to be scrolling on his phone, but his eyes met mine as I passed. When I reached my door, he stared directly at me. I froze, feeling uneasy, but convinced he was just another guest. I unlocked and locked my door, but the encounter left me on edge. The next morning, a cold draft brushed my face. The balcony door was slightly open, though I had locked it. My stomach dropped. I shut the door, checked the room, and told myself it was an oversight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next afternoon, the man was sitting in the hallway, closer to my door. He didn't look up, but I felt tension. I quickly entered my room, realizing he'd been outside for at least 2 days. That night, things escalated. I went to bed early, exhausted. Midnight, I heard a faint click, like a door unlocking. I held my breath, listening. Silence followed, then soft, deliberate footsteps inside my room. Panic surged through me as I froze, barely breathing as footsteps approached. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the situation. A presence loomed at my bed's foot. I cracked my eyes to see the man from the hallway, his phone screen illuminating him as he took pictures. My heart pounded, fearing he'd hear it. He'd entered my room using the fake room service website, stealing my Hilton Honors login information to access the mobile key feature. He stood less than 2 feet away, and I was helpless. He snapped another picture before turning and walking toward the door. As it clicked shut, I called the police, my hands shaking. They arrived quickly, but couldn't find him. Hotel security confirmed he'd entered using the mobile key feature, but couldn't explain how he'd gained access. They also showed me footage of him loitering outside my room daily at 3 p.m. He was arrested 2 weeks later for an unrelated incident. The most chilling part? Police found dozens of pictures of me and others from inside my room and around the hotel on his phone. He'd been stalking me, watching my every move. I checked out the next morning and haven't stayed in a hotel since. The thought of someone watching me while I slept is a nightmare I can't escape. Story 6. There's Something Stalking the Woods Around My House by Fit Combination 4626. I live in northern Michigan, and I just wanted to tell some stories that I've experienced while living here to maybe get an idea on what exactly could be happening. I know it's not human, though, that's for sure. To paint a picture, I live in a small town just below the Upper Peninsula and around 25 minutes from Mackinac. I live in a small neighborhood near the countryside with the fields and all that. I have a giant field next to my house, and my neighborhood wraps in a small circle with the small woods in the middle. There's also a big woods across the road from my house where this story takes place. Pretty much woods everywhere, though. This happened around 2 to 3 years ago on a school night around 5 p.m. when me and my friend, who is also my neighbor from across the woods from me, decided to go exploring in the woods across the road. Now, at the time we didn't know, but it was private property. We were like 12 and 13, so we were just being dumb. When we crossed the road to go into the woods, I noticed these 2 darker figures on the hill of the road. I didn't find it strange because there was a little house up there on the side of the road where a couple of guys lived, so I assumed they were just doing their own thing until I started staring more and noticed something strange about them. They were a little over 6 feet in height, so pretty tall, but the odd thing was, when they walked, it was like the back of their knees unnaturally bent backwards, almost like they had some noodle legs or something, and they walked into the same woods, just further up the road. I don't know why I ignored it at the time. I know that was super dumb, especially being a young girl. We went into the woods anyway and explored for a bit. Everything was fine, and after an hour, it started to get dark, so we wanted to head back home because it was a school night. We went pretty far into the woods and got a little lost. We kept going in circles, and we knew this because we kept coming back to the same marked tree a few times. Around the fourth time it happened, we sat down on this log for a minute to just take a look at our surroundings and try to get home before it got any darker. That's when things turned bad fast. We started hearing noises that oddly enough sounded close and far away at the same time. It was so strange. We couldn't tell how far it was, but it was coming from our left. We were silent because once we saw the marked trees and all that, we knew it was private property, and that was also a reason we were trying to get out of there. Then, all of a sudden, we heard this loud scream of just pure agony that sounded like it was from a man. And before you say bobcat or anything close to it, I've heard them, and it wasn't that. It sounded like a man, but a little off. It was loud, and sounded like a guy around his 40s or 50s, I'd say, just to get the idea of the tone of voice. The scream lasted about 8 seconds, and it just went silent again. My friend was in tears, and we were frozen. We just started booking it a few seconds later to where we thought was most likely our best bet out. Luckily, we were able to see a red car on the main road through the trees that we followed the direction of to get out. We came out from the woods on the main road and crossed back to the side of the road my neighborhood was on. We were so relieved to finally be out, because it was just about getting dark in a few minutes. But something else happened. My friend thought it would be a good idea to scream at the woods, "Fuck you!" and flip off the trees and laugh. As soon as she did, these huge, tall trees that were not thin at all started rustling in a path from the woods to the road. These trees were rustling hard. I mean, all the way to the top of the tree branches were moving and fast, like something was running toward us. But we couldn't see anything at all. We jumped and bolted to my house, and my mom drove her home because we were definitely not walking near those woods. I don't know what it was, but I have many more experiences with what I believe to be the same thing. It's gotten to the point that my mom has seen it as well, in the same woods at night, while looking for the neighbor's lost dog. She said all she saw was red eyes, about 6 feet high in the woods. She got out of the car, and it made a huge growl, so she booked it back in the car. Story 7. Swamp Creature in Northern Michigan. Tonight I was talking to my partner about weird childhood experiences growing up, and now that I rehash the story from my childhood, it gives me chills down my spine. For starters, I grew up in northern Michigan, about an hour south of the bridge, right on the banks of Lake Huron. My aunt lived about half an hour north on an inland lake with her husband and 4 kids. I spent a lot of time out there with her, as I was an only child, and my cousins were all around my age. I have 2 specific memories from her house that haunt me to this day. The first one happened when I was around 5 years old, and when I say I remembered this so clearly and vividly, I'm not lying. It was so traumatizing, it's burnt into my memory, unfortunately. My aunt lived right on a large inland lake. To the left of her, there were a handful of neighbors, but to the right of her house, it was all swamp for about a quarter of a mile, besides about 100 feet of yard that was all hers. As kids, my 2 older cousins and I would poorly swing golf balls into the swamp, and then when we ran out of balls, we would go look for them in the swamp. This specific day, our large family was throwing a barbecue. My grandpa was watching us 3 grandchildren hit the balls into the swamp, as the rest of our family was hanging out on the porch on the opposite side of the house. I remember hitting my ball almost completely to the left, so not straight out in front where the rest of the golf balls were typically being poorly hit. My little 5-year-old self ran through the ditch to the swamp to go retrieve my poorly swung ball. Once I reached the swamp, I looked around and could not find where the ball had gone. I remember turning right and seeing this strange, faceless figure standing about 10 feet away from me. To describe this figure, it was human-shaped and had absolutely no detail at all when it came to facial features, genitals, fingers, toes, or anything like that. It was completely blurred, almost as if it was nudity being blurred out on a television screen. The strangest part was that it was doing a T-pose, but shifting its torso back and forth, so its arms were swinging violently back and forth. I immediately screamed and started crying and ran over to my grandpa, and my other family ran over to ask what was wrong, and I told them. Of course, after checking the woods, they found nothing. A couple of years ago, I brought it up to my grandpa, and he says he remembers me doing that. It was just so strange because when I try to find possible cryptids or explanations, I can't find anything because the T-pose part is just so strange. Of course, there are faceless figures and whatnot, but does anyone know of anything doing the T-pose in a violent circular motion? That wasn't my only experience at the lake house, though. This next memory I remember perfectly because it was much more recent. Well, not too recent. I was 12 then. I'm now 24. Anyways, it was another night I was spending at my aunt's house. My mom used to work the night shift, so I used to spend a lot of nights out with my aunt and my cousins. However, this particular night, 3 out of 4 of my cousins were gone at sleepovers, leaving me with my 3-year-old cousin at the time, my aunt, and my uncle. I remember we were watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit on their television in the living room. I fell asleep on the love sack in the corner of the living room, which was very typical at the time. The living room was facing the swamp side of the house, and 2/3 of the walls were almost just straight windows with no curtains. They didn't need curtains, though. They had no neighbors, just some lakefront yard and a swamp. I remember waking up to the sound of knocking. I looked at the time on the CD player beneath the TV, and it was 2:08 in the morning. My first thought was their dog Doc was wagging his tail, and his tail was hitting the coffee table out in front of me. I remember verbally saying aloud, "Doc, stop it." The knocking continued, and I kept yelling at the dog to calm down. Doc was extremely energetic and still young at the time. When the sound didn't stop, I sat up in frustration and looked around for the dog, but Doc wasn't anywhere to be seen. Instead, I realized the knocking was coming from behind me. I turned around and saw a large, faceless figure, probably 7 feet tall, knocking on the window behind me. I always described this figure as what an old scuba diver would wear, as if the outline of his body was a vintage scuba suit. I don't know if I'm explaining it well, but what it's technically called is a Mark V dress. I remember instantly running to my aunt's room and shaking her and my uncle awake, telling them that a man is knocking on the window. My uncle even went so far as to go outside. He himself is a 6'5", 240-pound man, and he came back and said he didn't see anything. The rest of the night, I slept next to my aunt because I was so terrified. It's a story I still tell today. I don't have any more experiences from her house, but as I grew older, I stopped spending so much time out there. Back at Thanksgiving this year, I was talking to my aunt about that time and asked her if she's ever experienced anything strange out there. She said that when she built her garden, large numbers of birds used to get stuck and die in the fence, and she used to have to wake up extra early to clear them before any of us kids noticed. She said that daily, black birds got stuck in the chicken wire, at least 7 a day. The strange thing was, it only happened for a month and just randomly stopped. She thought someone was playing a nasty prank on her, but she never got to the bottom of it. She said another time when she was digging in the same garden, which, by the way, is very near to the spot of my first story, she found an old rusted skeleton key buried in cloth, which is strange because the house is relatively new. But she doesn't know how old the land is or the history. I don't know, just thought to share if anyone has any weird or similar stories, as I know apparently weird stuff happens in northern Michigan all the time. Story 8. My experience as a park ranger in the southern U.S. by Pine Devil. So this story is weird, not because of the contents, but because the settings sound like something from a bad cliché skinwalker story. But regardless, it isn't the typical story. I hope you enjoy it. I was a park ranger in the southern U.S. My park was known for its caverns and its springs that made for excellent fishing. I began my work there as a tour guide and a groundskeeper. This would often culminate in me taking people on cave tours and helping people find their way on hiking trails. The weird stuff started in the month of October, when, during the routine maintenance of the cave's lighting system, you would feel eyes on you. You could even sometimes hear the sound of feet slapping the wet floor occasionally. I really didn't enjoy having to change the light bulbs for that reason. That being said, there was a phenomenon that when you would be closing up the museum and gift shop for the night, you would hear voices. A few times, it would sound like guests, which I could explain away. But during one night, I could hear someone speaking on the second story of the museum. Kind of irritated, I walked up there to let the guests know that the park was shutting down for the night and that they would have to head back to the campgrounds. However, it was pitch black the moment I got up the stairs, and I couldn't hear anyone anymore as I made my way through the museum and toward its balcony area. The moment I crossed the threshold, I heard something hit the trees outside and tear off through the underbrush. I don't know about this, though. It could have been a raccoon or something, but it was certainly odd. Many times walking through the trails from base to other resting points and ranger huts, you would sometimes hear this meow that just sounded off. It sounded off because it was a weird Chinese motion sensor we had in the ranger station to let others know if someone was trying to sneak in and steal things during park hours. The strange part is that this meow would be heard just in the tree line and literally miles from my station. Keep in mind that no other stations had this motion sensor, and it was a running joke with other stations about how awful this motion sensor was. It was bizarre, and the sound would move around you in circles as you hiked. During the rainy season, it seemed to get worse. I suppose when the caves would flood and push whatever thing was living in the deeper, unexplored parts out into the tourist areas. I would often hear other rangers' voices from the areas that were closed off for flooding. These areas were literally inaccessible because of 10 or so feet of water. On one occasion, as I was leading my tour through these caves, I heard a very close friend of mine ask me, "Hey, would you mind coming over here and helping me?" from a closed-off area. The room was dark, half-flooded, and it seemed that even the people on the tour knew that. I could see the color leave their faces. We had explained to people thoroughly that some areas were literally inaccessible due to flooding beforehand. Against my better judgment, I left my group. I made sure the lights were bright. I went in and swept the light around, but when I say this room is massive, I mean it. The largest in the tour cave. I heard one slosh, and that was just about all I could justify being around for. The water was dark and cold, and the room was so vast my terrible mag light was being eaten by the dark. I made the rest of my tour fast and got back to the surface, went back to the ranger station, and asked them where my coworker was. The receptionist casually told me that he'd clocked out about an hour ago, before my tour even began. Another notable experience was when I had to go down the crawl space of the museum once more to get weed whacker string. I was sitting there in this musty cobblestone basement that spanned under this 1800s massive building with a dirt floor and multiple stone columns running the length of the crawl space. I was trying to untangle this weed whacker string when I heard someone from further in the basement do the cliché, "Psst." Weirdly enough, I guess I hadn't put it together yet, So I spoke back. "What do you need?" Somehow thinking it was a coworker or something. "Come back here." It was possibly the creepiest thing I have ever heard. I'm not going to give you the "something sounded off and I can't explain it" spill. The reason it sounded off was because it sounded like the way crows will mimic people's speech, that low, weirdly chortling way they sound. I couldn't see what was talking to me, so I simply grabbed my weed whacker string and hurried out of the crawl space door. Shutting it behind me definitely had that feeling of something rushing up behind before I locked the door. Some weird, possibly related things were that when I asked a senior ranger about it, he said, "Don't worry about it. It happens." We also had a weird string of finding empty baby carriages and clothes up in the trees or at the bottom of gulches, and a man that claimed he saw a mermaid in one of the local springs. Another man insisted on cornering me and screaming at me that the devil lived in the caves. There were also a metric ton of caves in the park that were still active and we didn't take tours through, one of which I heard rumors about that apparently had crabs and other little microbes in it from prehistoric times. I learned this when I eavesdropped on 2 university people talking to a senior. One cave that the local teens made out in had a massive drop-off into a sinkhole, rumored to be where Confederate gold was hidden. Another had a ton of pottery and arrowheads in it, which was very interesting from an anthropology standpoint. These were weird times in my life. The park, while I won't name it, had a wonderful vibe of mystery and wonder to it, although a few years later, half of the staff was laid off for selling native pottery and stuff illegally. So as you can imagine, I'm glad I moved on in time to avoid that garbage. I'm not necessarily trying to convince anyone of anything, just sharing some weird experiences. I hope you enjoy them. Story 9. Escape from the Unknown by Sharp Butterknife 9. This happened quite a few years ago. I had an affinity for a particular white substance in the form of lines back then. One very cold, snowy night around 11 p.m., I went for a walk to meet my dealer. I had never been to his place before, so he gave me the address to his small 2-story apartment building with maybe 6 units in it. Upon arrival, I noticed several strangers inside. After they had hit their pipes, 2 clearly unwashed guys came over to sit at the dining table while I waited for my dealer. I've never smoked anything besides weed and cigarettes. I was instantly uncomfortable. They tried making small talk, but I grew increasingly uneasy, giving only short, vague answers. I quickly paid for my stuff, grabbed the baggie, and got up from the table. That's when one of the guys offered to walk me home. My heart started to sink. I politely declined. "Oh, I'm okay, thanks. I don't live far." The other guy stood up. "No, really, we can walk you. We don't mind. We have to get going anyway." That's when my instincts finally kicked in. I became very aware and very scared. I immediately thought, I'm fully dressed and ready to go, but they still have to put on their coats and shoes. If I leave now, I'll get a head start and quickly disappear. They said something else as I headed for the door, but I pretended to take a phone call, waved goodbye to my dealer, and closed the door behind me. I jogged down the hallway to the outside door, and once I got outside, I ran for the street. I decided not to take the fast route home because, from the building, they'd be able to see me. I didn't want them knowing even the slightest direction I lived in if they really were following me. The building was at the end of a street, so instead of going straight up the hill the way I initially came from, I turned right and started jogging. I kept glancing back, and finally I saw them, about a block behind, following me. The street I needed, Stanley Street, was across the intersection on my left, about another block ahead at a 4-way light. As I approached the intersection, I noticed the corner house on my right. There was an older man sitting on his porch, smoking. I recognized him. He was another dealer I had met only once, a few weeks before, when my usual guy was dry. I choked up as I got to his porch and asked if he remembered me. He did, and asked, "What's wrong?" I quietly told him, "I think these two guys are following me," and asked if I could go inside for a minute until they passed. He didn't hesitate. We went inside, past his front living room, and into the kitchen, where I explained what happened. He told me not to worry, that I was safe there, and I could stay as long as I needed to. Then we heard a knock at the door, and I started to panic. He went to the door, looked through the peephole, and yelled, "Just a minute!" He came back quickly and whispered that he knew the guys and was going to invite them in to have a hit. He told me to sneak out through his back door, which was beyond the kitchen, go to the right of the yard, and find the gate. This would lead to a side street. He instructed me to creep up along the side of his house, close to the shrubs, and check the porch to make sure they went inside. I followed his plan, and when the coast was clear, I didn't jog. I sprinted up Stanley Street and zigzagged all the way home. When I think back now, I'm in disbelief at my actions and how foolish I was. I thought I was invincible. I was far too trusting. But I truly thank God for the man who helped me that night. I don't know what those two guys wanted from me, but I'm forever grateful I never had to find out. Story 10. I saw something strange at Fremantle Prison. This is my first post on Reddit, but honestly I don't know where else to talk about this, and it's been weighing on me for years. For some backstory, I, 19 and female, used to live in Western Australia, Perth to be exact, with my mother and my stepfather. This story happened when I was in year 5, around 10 years old. Moving was rather difficult for me in year 4. New place, new school, new siblings, but finally away from the abuse and torture of my old home. Thankfully, after a year, things got easier. While my mental health was still an issue, I was settling in nicely with this new school. Just a few months before my birthday in year 5, my class and another year 5 class organized an excursion to Fremantle Prison as a history lesson. While I was nervous because it wasn't a place I was familiar with, I had my friends to lean on if I was overwhelmed. Once we arrived on the bus, the tour guide took us through the old prison. I was honestly amazed at the history and the layout. It was truly rather interesting. Eventually, the guide took us to the second floor. We stopped on the side as the guide taught us about the safety nets in between the stairs and how they were put in place because the inmates would attempt to either kill themselves or others by pushing others or jumping off the rail guards themselves. As the guide was talking about it, I subconsciously looked to the side, down the hall to where the cells were, being the curious 10-year-old I was. For those who know about Fremantle Prison, you might also know that it's said to be haunted by inmates that had died there in the past. As I looked down the hall, holding my friend's hand because I was overwhelmed by the amount of people, I noticed something. A person. I don't mean just a shadow. A whole fucking person. He was middle-aged, maybe around 45 to 50, and he was completely naked except for some white underwear and a large wound on his head. We stared at each other for a good 10 seconds before he walked into his cell and disappeared from sight. The cell doors were shut. He just phased through the door. I was horrified. I held my friend's hand tighter and shuffled so I was standing behind them. "What's wrong?" they asked, their voice soft and kind like always. I didn't respond. Even if I wanted to, my voice just wouldn't come out. My friends stared at me for a moment before sighing. I'm guessing they assumed I was just a little shaken by the whole inmates committed suicide thing and wrapped their arm around my shoulders, keeping me close. Now I know my mental state back then was shitty, and I had, and still do have, hallucinations due to the trauma I went through, but I genuinely believe that must have been something else. My hallucinations were, and never are, that detailed. Anytime I see what appears to be a person, it's usually just a shadow, but this guy looked real. I've never talked about this with anyone, not even my therapist, because honestly, just thinking about it makes me paranoid, but I really needed to get this off my chest. Story 11. Did he time travel? I am going to try and make this story short and get to the point. I was visiting family members in Mexico in the state of Zacatecas. This happened precisely on December 25th in 2019 or 2020. I was at my uncle's ranch, and my cousins and I decided to mess around by going to the cemetery to scare each other and see if we could freak each other out. This cemetery is right down the road from my uncle's ranch, just a 10-minute walk or so. We got to the cemetery and had a little fun that night. As we were leaving, this 8-year-old boy we didn't recognize appeared from behind us. He ran at full speed toward us, crying. We all screamed because we got scared and thought it was something paranormal, but this was actually a boy. We were there for almost an hour, and we never saw this kid. We took him home with us, and he said he was playing hide and seek with his siblings during the day and hid in an abandoned room in the cemetery. When he got out from his hiding spot, he said it was already dark. He was scared and saw us leaving and ran to us. I found it weird because we were all inside that same abandoned room, but he wasn't inside. We got him food and water, and the next morning we drove him to the city and turned him into the police. We stayed longer for the investigation. What the police told us, we couldn't believe. The kid we found had been missing for over 15 years. They even showed us an old list on the computer of missing kids from a year in the early 2000s. His name and picture were there. We looked back at the kid, and it was the same kid. But how was he still the same age? His parents were called, and we left the police station. I remember seeing a family walking out with him, crying and hugging him. I don't know how this could have happened, but I'm just happy that the kid was reunited with his family. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more terrifying true tales. If you would like to submit a story of your own, head to our subreddit, r/thedreadweaver, or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.